Welcome to the Three Things Podcast. I'm David Iglesias, Director of Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics. You may be wondering why this podcast is called Three Things. You were probably taught by your parents, like I was, that it was impolite to talk to people about three things: religion, politics, and money. But what happens if your job is to talk about those three things? Well, join me for the next 25 minutes and let's find out. Our guest today is Steve Preston. Mr. Preston has served at the highest levels of both the government and the private sector. He led successful turnarounds as the CEO of two private equity-owned companies, headed two major federal agencies, Housing and Urban Development and the Small Business Administration, during times of national crisis, and served as the CFO of two Fortune 500 companies during times of significant change and restructuring. He's currently CEO of Goodwill Industries. He lives with his wife, Molly, and their 5 children, ages 18 through 25. Mr. Preston graduated with distinction from Northwestern University and received an MBA from the University of Chicago. He serves on numerous boards, including the Board of Advisors for the Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics. Welcome to Three Things Podcast, Steve.
Thank you for having me.
So let's just get into it. I'd like to start with a little bit of a background. Obviously, you're blessed with a great background, but you picked business. Can you tell us why you picked business over some other profession?
I didn't think I was going to pick business. I went to college and I thought I would probably either go into law or public policy school. Ultimately, I began to get somewhat interested in business. And what happened was really just a chain of events. I was graduating from college. I wanted to get a job for a couple of years before I went to grad school, and I got offered a job in this terrific training program at a large bank. And they offered to put me through business school and put me through a rotation program. And and before you know it, I realized I loved what I was doing, and I went and got that MBA. And I think the message for students certainly is I didn't have any of it figured out, but jumping in with a great opportunity that provided me with a platform and training and kind of gave me an opportunity to kind of test some things was critical to my figuring out that I really did love business.
And looking back, do you believe you made the right choice?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was a terrific journey, just rich with experience, with training and development, situational management. And when I went into the government and now in the not-for-profit sector, there were so many experiences, so many pockets of knowledge that I drew upon to be effective in those spaces. And I just don't think I would have ever been able to have the impact that I did had I not been blessed with just a lot of really great training and experience in the private sector.
It seems like you have a long history of leadership during times of crisis, both in the private and public sector. How soon did you realize that much of your career would be in leading organizations during times of crisis or change?
Well, I often seemed going up through my career to be the person that would get kind of thrown into complicated, messy situations, and I just never really shied away from them. And, the private sector, I did a lot of work with companies going through very big change and being, kind of an important part of that process. But it was really the experience at the SBA where I got hired into a massive crisis, and then at HUD, where I got hired into another massive crisis that really put me in situations that were, far more kind of heavily charged and immediate than some of the situations I'd seen before.
Now, you strike me as being a pretty calm person. Is that your normal state?
No.
Okay.
I am. I think what I do when I go into a crisis is I figure out very quickly that A, if you're the leader, you need to be the leader. And you need to figure out how to enter that situation as productively and as effectively as possible. Because, there's so much riding on the situation, and people are looking for leadership. People are looking for a path forward. That's the accountability that you have as the leader. Mm-hmm. And so it's much healthier to go in eyes wide open and say, okay, everybody calm down. What's happening? What are the issues? How do we address them? How do we chart a path forward? So I'm probably, in some ways, I probably am calm in those situations because I know what it takes.
Absolutely. So you took over the SBA, also known as the Small Business Administration, in 2006 when it was under fire for its disaster loan operations response to Hurricane Katrina. And you completely reworked the disaster operations, implementing reforms that cut key processing times for disaster loan applications by up to 90%. That's a 90. And then, within 2 years, in June of 2008, you were asked to become the Secretary of HUD, Housing and Urban Development Department. And you had to deal with the fallout of the housing crisis shortly thereafter. So here's my question, Steve. What training and experiences helped prepare you for these two very difficult situations?
Well, like I said before, classical business skills were essential. I walked into the SBA and I pulled on every bit of financial training I had. I had led operational improvement technology initiatives before. That came in very handy. I had a deep understanding of financial markets because of my background starting on Wall Street, which was very relevant to the work we were doing. But I think the most important experience I drew upon, and my background had been really entirely working in service organizations, was the knowledge that in any service organization, you need to work through your people. Your people need the training, they need the tools, they need the support to be effective in their roles. They need leadership to help them rise to the occasion. They need a rallying cry. And it's also embedded in the knowledge that the experience that I'd had that taught me that people want to be great. People want to be able to serve well. People are proud if they can bring something good in a service role, and certainly in the government. When you're in that case, we were helping people rebuild their homes and rebuild their lives, rebuild their businesses in some cases. When my employees at the SBA couldn't be great, when they couldn't deliver that service, they felt terrible. They wanted to be able to serve. And so the knowledge that underlying energy and desire and in some ways wholeness was lacking was an important part of what defined my leadership during that time.
Was it helpful for you or your team members to actually go down to New Orleans and actually see the catastrophe that had happened there?
Well, that's an interesting question. One of the things I needed to do was bring the catastrophe to them. Many of them were inside of a large call center, a large loan processing operation, and it was very much focused on what was happening inside the building and not outside the building. And I did two things. I needed to change the conversation about whether it was technology's fault or their fault or whatever and what was broken. And I called a 3-day meeting for all the leaders in the disaster operation, and I committed to be there personally, which in the government, which is very hierarchical, is kind of a big deal.
Yes.
And we came armed with a ton of research and a ton of data and information about what the issues were. But I opened up the meeting with a video. And what I had done is I'd sent my cameraman down to the Gulf, and I said, I just want you to videotape people telling their stories about what they needed and why their loan was important and what it meant to their lives. And we just played this video of people telling their stories. And the place was completely silent. I said, look, that's where the battle is. That's who we serve. And so any of the conflict we have internally is irrelevant. We need to work through that, because ultimately those are the voices that need to live in our heads. And then once we fixed a lot of the processes, I did a town hall I did a public town hall in New Orleans where anybody could come and talk about their problems with the SBA. And I brought all of the leadership from the processing center to listen to those stories and to work with those people one-on-one. And it was a complete game changer because it connected my people with a desperate need externally. And they were able to just grab onto their roles in a completely different way. And it lifted them. It really lifted them to a place that they hadn't been before. And it was just so exciting to watch.
I'm sure it humanized the problem in a dramatic fashion. It wasn't just a bunch of government forms and numbers and charts. It was actually people sharing their desperate circumstances.
Yeah, it really did.
So after that, you got picked even for a larger crisis, a national crisis, and that was the housing market crash in the fall of 2008. At what point did you realize we were going to have a problem?
Right. So I was at the SBA before I went to HUD. And so one of the things that the SBA does is lend guarantee loans to small businesses. And so I had a good view of what was happening in the business credit market. And during 2009, clearly the housing market issues were growing, but many people believed it was limited to a slice of the market called subprime, which were the riskiest loans. And they did not believe it was going to mushroom more broadly into housing or certainly not into other credit markets. And I'll never forget pressing a senior administration official at the time on his assessment that it wasn't going to bleed into other sectors because I was watching the banks pull back on lending to small business, which is a very different market. And this was happening in middle of 2008. And then things started getting much worse in the spring of 2007 rather. Things started getting much worse by early 2008. And so by the time I was nominated to become the housing secretary, things were really surging forward, and I knew I was climbing onto a Bronco, and then it continued to escalate. So I think the precursors were there for some time. It was just I don't think anybody believed that it would mushroom to the degree that it did.
No, and to continue the rodeo imagery, I think you didn't just climb onto a Bronco, Steve. You climbed onto a bull with sharp horns. I can't imagine. As a practicing Christian, how did your faith affect your leadership during this very difficult time, and not just for you as a leader, but for the country?
Well, so first of all, it's a humbling thing to be placed into a role like that. They're very public roles. There's a lot of deference that's provided to you. You're put in front of a lot of media. You're with the President of the United States. It's a time where I think as a person of faith, you have to say, this is the work that God prepared in advance for me to do. Ephesians 2. Mm-hmm. And it's about that work. This isn't about me. This isn't about it was so important to come into that with a sense of humility. And I was called to be a lot of things that were consistent with my faith during that time. I was called to be a leader of large groups of people that in a way that inspired them and focused them on serving people in need, like we just talked about. I was called to be excellent in that place when it really mattered and to be accountable for that. I was called to be a peacemaker, working with people from all political perspectives and trying to work with them on a solution. And I certainly needed, I needed strength to be every one of those things. And I'm sure I failed at it many times, but it's amazing how, when you lean on your faith and when you lean on just the so many teachings of our faith, how God prepares us to be able to be people that we never thought we could be.
Yes.
And so, it was a stressful, it was a crazy time, but it was just a time of enormous blessing because I felt that, I felt so much of what, God had prepared me to do was being used in a place that I cared about deeply.
And some of our younger listeners may not remember Katrina. I remember like it was yesterday, as I'm sure you do as well. And I'm trying to compare it with any other natural disaster in American history, and I'm just coming up with blanks. Was this the largest rescue effort ever for a large American city in American history, or can you think of something that was as large or larger?
No, I can't think of anything as large. It was the largest sort of impact from a natural disaster, and I think the other thing that was completely different about it is it was a time when we had helicopters flying over people stranded on their roofs who
Yes.
couldn't get away. We saw thousands of people stranded in a convention center who couldn't get access to basic needs. We knew people were dying. We knew people were drowning and going through horrific things. And there were days when people couldn't get the response they needed for just the most basic human needs. So the country watched this horrific unfolding. And then, unfortunately, for months and to an extent even years, many of the basic supports that people needed to get their lives back were not available to them. So it was a time of, I think grieving, but
Yes.
also deep frustration that we as a country couldn't come together to help people in a more immediate way when they were facing such incredible difficulty.
So I went to New Orleans with my wife a few years ago. We met some friends, and what struck me was a couple of things. It looks pretty normal now. And
Yeah.
secondly, our friends took us to a Starbucks, and up at about, I don't know, 8 or 9 feet, there was a black line painted on the wall.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I asked about that, and I said, well, that was the maximum height of the flooding, which
Yeah.
was astounding because that was virtually to the ceiling of that building.
Yeah. Well, if you had gone down there not terribly long after the incident, you would have seen those lines on a lot of buildings which were from the water. You would have also seen check marks and other notations on buildings to indicate whether they'd been searched for survivors, and any number of other things. So the ravages of that time were very visible on buildings per se, not long after the storm.
Yes, it seemed like some cataclysmic things happened during President George W. Bush's watch. Clearly, 9/11 during first term, and then Hurricane Katrina. Who would have known?
Yeah, and then the financial crisis.
Thank you. And then at the very end, the debt crisis. So just within an 8-year window, you had three enormous things that, some presidents go 8 years and nothing like this happens. Tell us about your call in quotes to work in government. Do you feel like you were called to work or not?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. As I mentioned earlier, when I was a college student, I didn't really think I'd go into business. I thought I might go work for an NGO. In fact, I was an international politics major, and by the time I was graduating, I was actually looking at public service schools. As I mentioned, I fell in love with business. I went down a very different track, built a life of, I think I was in business for over 20 years before I went into government. But it was interesting. Had a senior executive role at a large company. We had 5 kids. They were all little. We were doing well, embedded in my community. And I just felt this deep, deep sense of stirring that I needed to do something different, make a different kind of impact. And it really began to, move me. And I prayed and worked through it over a couple of years. And I started looking at different possibilities, and this opened up. And for some reason, it just was like clear as a bell when it came across the transom, and I said, I just know this is where I need to serve. And I think sometimes when you go through a period of change, and in my case, God putting it on my heart to think about a different path in life. This had happened to me once before, earlier in my career, when I decided to leave Wall Street. The harder you look, the deeper you pray, the more open you become to the possibilities. And, little did I know I would be taking my 5 little kids and selling my house and taking a big cut in pay and uprooting the family and, moving
Yes.
off to Washington. But I have to tell you, it couldn't have been a better decision, and I couldn't have been more blessed. And, I love that vision in Isaiah 6 when Isaiah sees God in all of his glory and realizes just, what that glory is and recognizes, his sin against that and the fact that he's probably doomed. And then he's forgiven and has this sort of, amazing revelation that he's forgiven. And then God says, who will I send? Who will go for me? And he just says, here am I, send me.
Yes.
And it's this realization that when you're sent, like you're walking, you're sent for this, greater eternal plan. And you're sent, not, you're not going to ask, well, how long will it take? And, what's this? And Isaiah just said, no, send me to that place. And I think when we really have a sense of calling, nothing else seems to matter. And when you follow that sense of calling, I think there's just deep blessing in it.
Yeah, and in fact, that's one of my favorite passages in the Old Testament. It kind of makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up when I hear stories like yours. So you also had a business background. You worked in some large Fortune 500 companies. Can you tell me how helpful that was, had to have a business background and how applicable that was to be a high-level federal government leader?
Yeah, so it's great training for leadership. It's great training for any number of skills. It's great training for decision making because you are taught how to make decisions based on data, based on desired outcomes. You're used to approaching things from a rigorous, deep perspective, and so it's very good foundation for that. But you also learn the realities of our economy. You learn how businesses grow. You learn how they become competitive. You learn to manage people, and the government can be a very detached and very insular place. And unfortunately, many decisions get made for a lot of reasons, but they're not always based in rigor or a clear view of the outcomes they're going to drive. And so that real world experience gives you a great touch point for understanding the reality outside the Beltway. Because I think when you grow, kind of grow up in the business world, you see a lot of action. You do, and the skills, the experiences, the knowledge you take with you going into the government is extremely helpful.
Well, I think I know what you're going to say to this question, but as you may know, I worked for former New Mexico Governor Gary Johnson, who was a self-made millionaire, and he promised, and I campaigned with him, so I remember this, he campaigned that he would run government like business. So based on your experience, is that even possible? And if it is possible, is that a good idea?
Yeah, it's a great idea. And it can be possible, but it's hard to do. As I mentioned before, I don't think there's enough rigor in decision making in the government, and people make decisions for a lot of reasons. But we need to know what works for our people and how to advance solutions based on evidence that work for our people. And I think we also need to stop spending massive amounts of money on things that don't work. And it's very hard to pull back on programs, even if they're not working, for any number of reasons. We need to be able to train our government employees to be excellent with foundational skills. And this is something I've been very involved in for years now, either training myself and being involved in efforts to advance opportunities for government employees. We need to learn how to pay our bills,
Yes.
Which we don't in the government. And we also need to learn how to be accountable. And the accountability and oversight mechanisms in the government, as much as we hear about them, are not very strong. And I think the rigor of business would do a lot of, would be very beneficial if it was more evident in the government realm.
Somebody said, I can't remember who, but someone said that there's nothing as permanent as a temporary government program.
Yeah.
A genius statement. I mean, I worked in a temporary government building which lasted almost 70 years. That was the Navy Annex next to the Pentagon. I mean, that was only built for a few years to last World War II, and it was there for decades. So I can actually reify that statement. Uh, Steve, I'd like to kind of turn my focus to your present position. You're with Goodwill, a nonprofit social enterprise. I got this off your website, whose mission is to help people reach their full potential through learning and the power of work. Got a few questions related to that. What are some of the ways Goodwill accomplishes its mission?
Yeah, well, thank you for highlighting Goodwill. It's such an important organization. We generally know it by the stores, but the money generated in those stores helps people in our communities. Many of the people we deal with, many of the people who come to us for support, are people with challenges in life, people who don't have the skills they need to compete in the job market. 60% of the people that come through our doors are people of color, many of them who've not been provided equitable opportunities through their lives. We see them, the way I often describe it is, we see them in a situation where equity, the loss of equity has created, or the lack of equity has created real challenges in life. So we work with people who need support to realize their potential in life. And so we do it we hire 141,000 employees across North America, and many of those people are people who've got significant life challenges, and we're often their first step on the way to a career. 1.5 million people come through our doors every year for face-to-face support. So we have 650 career training centers across the country, and you can come in and you can get, we'll assess your skills and we'll assess what you need in life. We'll provide you with training and development and put you on a pathway to be able to get the position you want. And we provide online training to 24 million people a year.
Oh my.
The other thing we do, which we don't focus on talking about enough, is we keep 5 billion pounds of stuff out of landfills. We are the largest driver of the resale economy, and the textile industry is one of the largest polluters of any industry. Yes. And we are, and it's getting worse. The throwaway culture with clothing has been increasing the amount of production, and we're a very important part of helping our environment. So we've got a lot of ways that we've been very successful in this. Recently, we've launched extensive programs in digital training. In 2.5 years, we trained over 900,000 people on digital skills. We're advancing credential programs. We've got programs with 140 community colleges that help people get credentials for very specific skills for specific jobs. We've begun to expand our support for people coming out of incarceration so that they can get all the help they need to move on in life. And we do a lot of work with people who've got physical and mental disabilities and help them reach their potential through relevant support.
Well, I had no idea the impact that Goodwill made. I've got 4 daughters in their 20s, and they are all fashionistas, and they all love Goodwill. I mean, they go to Goodwill all the time. It's really remarkable the value that they can find there. And I have to tell you, having been the son of the greatest generation parents, I was taught never to throw anything away that was usable. So I go to Goodwill a lot, and I know it'll be reused and hopefully find a good family to use the stuff.
And those donations very directly provide opportunity, and they provide opportunity for people in the stores, and they generate funds for people who need training and development to find jobs. And I have to tell you, at a time like what we're facing now, where unemployment is, at depression levels,
yes,
and we look at the people who've lost their job, it's very disproportionately people with lower incomes, people with lower education levels, and people of color.
Yes. And
those are all the populations that are least resilient and least able to handle the job loss. And so if we can work with more people to tool them with the relevant skills that they need for the jobs that are available, and make sure that good jobs that are available, it is absolutely transformative in a person's life.
What are some of the barriers to achieving Goodwill's mission?
I think there are a number of barriers. I think as a society, we need a broader understanding that investing in a person is required to really change a life, right? When somebody is in prison, it costs roughly $40,000 a year to keep them in prison.
Right.
When they come out of prison, they have no money, no housing, no job, no network, and often not a lot of help. Just think about if we just took one more year of investment of $40,000 in that person to help them to get training, to help them get an apartment, to help them get counseling, because re-entering society when you've been in a prison for 15 or 20 years is tough. If we could just invest in people's lives in ways that are relevant and meaningful to help them get on the track and to help them reach their potential, it would be transformative in our country. And we don't think about it that way. We don't think as a finance person. I think the return on investment is huge.
Yes.
People can support a family. They become taxpayers. They don't need a lot of services. So beyond just the remarkable, value it enables in a life change, the dollars and cents even make sense. And so when you look at the things that are funded through different government programs, educational programs that are funded, a lot of the workforce development programs that are funded, a lot of them are not focused on driving the kind of efficacy that is needed to truly change a person's life. I think the other barrier is just getting employers to realize that, their best employee might be somebody who really needs that job, who's never had a chance, because they're going to be thankful, they're going to give it everything they've got, they're going to invest in themselves. So, we have challenges internally in terms of funding and all that type of thing, but I think the biggest barrier is society, whether it's all of us in understanding it, whether it's our lawmakers, whether it's employers, understanding what it takes to help people be successful and committing to make that happen. And there's just so much that we're called to do as people of faith in bringing wholeness to people and bringing wholeness to society. And I think this is right down the center for that calling.
That's wonderful. So you've been in government, you've been in business, and now you're working for a very large nonprofit. What advice would you give to a college student who's interested in one of these sectors?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things I would tell people. You don't need to start in the sector that you end up in, right? So you can have a long and varied career. If you put a stake in the ground today, it doesn't start there. I started in finance. I went into business. I went into government, went back into business, and now I'm in nonprofit. So one of the great things about our society is you have options. Right. I think for somebody starting out, there's a couple of things I'd say. First of all, really figure out the kind of work that leads you to flourish. And, when you're doing the work itself, do you feel like the best you have to give comes out of you? Believe it or not, when I was in college, I loved statistics. I loved doing statistical research. I loved the ability to look at qualitative issues and quantify them. And I began to nurture those talents. And I realized that took me to a lot of places in life that had nothing to do with statistics, but everything to do with a framework of analysis and contribution. So I think you figure out those skills that really, where you really feel something is great happening when I'm exercising these gifts. I think you need to nurture your talents, find a role where you can build your skills. I went into training programs at a bank and ultimately on Wall Street that built out competencies that I would have never had otherwise, and realized that your entire life from the get-go is about building your competencies, building your skills, and then applying them for value. And so I don't think people should should get overly focused on exactly the right job, because I think half of the time people don't really know what the job is,
Right.
until you get in the middle of it. But focus on developing yourself and becoming, developing what you have to give by investing in those competencies. And when I early in my career, I asked the CEO of a large company I was working for, what would you recommend for us? And the first thing he said is, never stop developing yourself, never stop learning. And I think coming out of college,
Yes.
That advice is particularly important because you're building your foundation.
Yeah, so I think your message is going to resonate with millennials and the iGens. I read somewhere that the average millennial is going to have 10 different jobs over the course of their career. That's much less true for baby boomers and not true at all for the greatest generation. I mean, I think my parents only had one or two employers their entire life. And I think that's encouraging the younger folks to realize that they'll probably start off and end up with a completely different type of work, and that's okay. So, just a few more questions, and then we'll wrap it up. I'm wondering if you have any suggested books or scripture verses you'd recommend to the listeners.
Well, I think if you're thinking about work, and I'm guessing a lot of people are already familiar with it, but I think Tim Keller's book, Every Good Endeavor, is
Yes.
a great lens to look at work through. And it really puts it on a solid footing in terms of understanding what it means to us and how we should approach it, and the value it has for us, because we're all made to work. That's what we're made to do, right?
Yes,
I
yes.
think we are deeply infused with a desire to create and to to contribute. And so I love many of the basic principles. I think from a scriptural perspective, I know where to start. I don't know where to finish. I think there are a couple of categories of verses I love. First of all, I'm a kind of guy, I love passages that tell us to live large.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned that as Isaiah quote,
Yes.
send me, I love in Hebrews 12 where it says to throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and run with perseverance the race marked out for us. And it's so important in that verse to know or acknowledge that Paul says the race marked out for us. But I also think it's really important to anchor in on passages that instruct us to be who we are on the inside. The Beatitudes. I think probably one of the most meaningful verses of any in the Bible is, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Or blessed are the pure in spirit, for they shall see God. It's just, the fruits of the Spirit in Galatians. I mean, as leaders, as people whether in business or government or wherever, having those foundations inside and being led by the Spirit in ways that allow what is right to come out of us is really important not to forget, especially for those of us who are hyper type A's.
Yes.
And I'll just close by saying, as somebody who's been in a number of leadership positions, one of the passages that just seems to kind of clear the air for me is in 1 Kings, when God tells Solomon to ask for whatever he wants, and he asks for wisdom.
Yes.
And he asks for a discerning heart to lead his people. And I just think when you look at that being the heart of a leader, you realize how much good can come from a leader. And our society desperately needs good leaders.
Amen.
It desperately needs leaders who care for the people that they lead and for the cause that they serve. And we see the great things that can happen through that. And we can see the damage that can happen through bad leaders. And so that's just such a meaningful passage for me.
Absolutely. Final question is this: is there anything I should have asked you but did not?
I just think that any students who are sitting there, the world is just such an unknown at this point in life, but there is so much before every one of them. It is such an exciting time. You don't know where your life is going to go, but remember, your calling isn't always for the future. Your calling is for today. And so I just encourage people to ask themselves who they are today. How are you serving people? How are you nurturing your faith? How are you growing? How are you forming? And big things happen in life because you do the little things and building those foundations and serving every day. And so I think as much as people can feel anxiety about the future, realize that your impact, your relevance is every day and every hour of every day. And time is precious. And I just encourage people to use that perspective.
Well, that's a wonderful way to end the podcast, Steve. Thank you so much for your time. Blessings on you and your new position and on your family.
Thank you so much.
Bye now.
You've been listening to a podcast from the Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics. You can find us at wheaton.edu/FP.